Hi, thanks for joining. In this video, we're going to talk about custom parse, which is a custom process that you can build in your DataForge file sources to really customize how you parse the raw data that's ingested. So if we get started here, if we're looking at our sources page in our DataForge workspace, the first thing that we actually want to do is open Databricks. And we're going to do two things. We're going to first go to compute, and we're going to make sure we have an all-purpose compute up and running. So if you don't have this, you'll want to create a new cluster compute. And then within here, you can use whichever settings make sense for you. But if you're in an AWS environment, you'll want to make sure you attach the instance profile. And then you'll most importantly want to make sure that in the libraries you've installed the DataForge SDK jar. And if you don't know where to find this, you can go back to DataForge, and in the main menu, go to Documentation, and then search for SDK. And then you'll find the custom notebook SDK article. We have examples of each of the custom processes which we'll use. But for this specifically, we'll use the creating an all-purpose cluster article to understand how to set that up. So if you scroll down here, you'll be able to actually find the jar location. So you can copy this out, go back to Databricks, and hit Install New. You'll use the jar option and you'll paste this in, and then you're going to replace this version section with the version number that you're actually running in DataForge. So you again can go back to DataForge, and at the bottom of the main menu you can find the version number. Otherwise you can find it in service configurations. So if we go back to our cluster, we've already got it up and running. We've got the SDK jar attached. So the next thing that I want to do is actually create a notebook that I can use for custom parse. So I'm gonna create that in my shared folder here. So we'll create a new notebook. We'll give it a name. I'm just gonna call it custom parse. Keep it simple, but you'll want to use a name that makes sense to you, that's easy to tell what's going on in the notebook. And the next thing that you want to do is actually hover over the name of the notebook. You want to grab, copy the notebook path, and then we'll go back to DataForge. And so now we can start creating the file source. If you already have one, you can skip this step, but we'll go to New, we'll create a new source, call it custom parse and sales data. We'll give it a description, and then I'm going to change my connection type to file, use the S3 connection I already have created, and then specify the file mask. And then in this case, I've got a delimited file, so CSV, and we're going to switch the parser over to use custom. So this is where you set it to custom parse. And then you'll have to select a cluster config for the custom parse process. So if you don't already have one available, you can use this icon next to it. That'll launch a new cluster config, and we'll name it custom parse notebook. And then for scale mode, I like to set it to single node while I'm in development and testing. It just reduces the amount of compute I have. And then we're going to set job task type to custom notebook, and that'll allow you to paste in the notebook path for your custom parse notebook. So we'll save these settings, and now we can go back to the source and refresh our cluster configs, and now I can choose that custom parse notebook that I had originally created. So I also like to clear the schedule while I'm developing and testing, so I know it only runs when I want it to. And then I also like to set the max retries down to 0 until I know that I have a working notebook, so that if something's wrong in the notebook, it doesn't continue to retry the same logic that I already know is broken. In this case, I'm going to turn off the delete file option as well. So we'll save this. And now we've got our saved source, we've got our cluster configuration set up in DataForge to point to our notebook. So at this point we want to go back to our notebook in Databricks, and we can start working on our custom parse logic. To do that, just as a cheat code, I'm actually going to look up that SDK documentation again, and we'll navigate to the custom parse section, and I can just copy and paste this example code as my starting point. So once I've got that in here, I'm just going to wipe out the example code other than the boilerplate. So this is what kind of a clean starting point that we can use, where we're importing, we've got some standard imports, we're importing the DataForge SDK, we're importing the data frame, and as well as the Spark SQL functions to transform some of the example data here. The next line is setting up a new val. I'm just calling it session, but you're calling new parsing session, and that's specific to the SDK and custom parse in particular. Then we're going to build a function that returns a data frame. And then lastly, we're going to close out that session by running session.run and passing the function within. One thing to note here is that all of this code that I'm working with today is in Scala. You can create your own custom notebooks using the language that you're most familiar with. At the end of the day, the cell that's interacting with the DataForge SDK does need to be in Scala, but you can easily do the majority of your logic in something like Python, and then pass the Spark data frame from Python to Scala using a temp view or temp table. So now that we've got this boilerplate in here, I can start working on my actual custom parse logic. And so the first thing that we're going to do in every custom parse notebook is actually reference the ingested file. So if you think about this, when DataForge runs a new input, the first process is always going to be ingestion. And as part of that ingestion process, we're taking the file that's ingested and creating a raw copy of it in the data lake. So the way that we reference that raw copy of the file is we can add a val, we'll name it file name, and then we're just going to use session.filePath. And so this will give us the path to that raw file that we can work with. And then the next thing we can do is start defining the data frame. So we'll add a val for the data frame and set that equal to spark.read. And in my example, I'm using a CSV file. So we're going to set that in the format. I'm going to add an option in here to tell Spark that there is already column headers in the file. And then we'll load the existing file using that val that we created for file name. And then for my example in particular, I want to do three things with the data. I want to add a new column, I want to reformat an existing column, and then I want to drop a column that I don't need. So to do that, I'm just going to copy over some existing code that I had. So we're going to use with column, we're going to create a new current timestamp column, and we're going to use the Spark SQL function to populate that. And then the next line, we're going to reformat an existing column that's already named modified date. This is a timestamp currently in my files, so I want to just convert it to an actual date format. So I'm using toDate and call to call that modified date column. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is just drop that last column that I know that I don't need. So now I've got a working custom parse notebook. So at this point, I can go back to DataForge and continue working in there. One thing to note is that with custom parse, you're going to need some form of the data actually living in your DataForge source to actually run and try out your notebook, right? Because we need to know basically what data to use for that parse process. So in order to do that, we'll go back to our DataForge source and we'll kick off a new data pull. And this is going to create a new input in the source, and we can see that the ingestion process already completed. I had a cluster up and running. However, when we hit the custom parse process, it's going to actually go to the new cluster configuration that we created. It's going to launch that cluster and specifically look for that notebook to run. So this will take a few minutes for the cluster to actually start up and start running. So we're going to skip forward until that's actually up and running. Okay, so it looks like our cluster launched correctly and then was able to run through all the processes successfully. So if we look at our new input here, we can check the status and we can see our custom parse process was launched and ran and then went on to the remainder of the standard process types. So one thing I wanted to show you that we didn't look at earlier is if we look back at the Sparky ingestion process here and we look at the logs, we can actually see that file path that we were working with in our notebook from the raw file that got created during the ingestion process. So this is ultimately what we're calling to start out the custom parse process. in our notebook here with the file path. So just something to note. The next thing that we want to do, or that I want to show you, is how to use custom parameters with your custom parse. So if we look back at our source and we go to the source settings, we can go to the parsing parameters here, and you'll see this custom parameters option. And so this is a JSON formatted field, so you can add in any custom parameter that you want to use in your process. So for mine, I'm just going to add an example tag that I'm going to use. So we'll say tag and ABC. So I'm going to save this as a custom parameter in my source settings, and then once that's saved, now I can go back to my notebook and I can actually reference that custom parameter from my source. So if I just add a new line here, I'll say val, I'm just going to name it custom param, keep it easy. And then the way that we're going to reference this is within parentheses, we're going to call session.custom parameters, and then a backslash, and then we'll call the actual custom parameter that got created. And I'm going to save it as a string. And then what I want to do with this, actually, I can do two things. One is I can log it directly in the custom parse process logs. So I can use some string interpolation here and just say tag is equal to that custom param. And then I also can add that as a column. So I'm going to add a column called tag to the data, and we're going to reference that same custom param. And one thing we have to do is actually use the lit function to reference that val. So if I run this again, one thing that is nice now that we actually have an input to work with, we have data ingested, is I can actually run this from either DataForge by doing a new pull now, or I can reset parsing on the existing input. Another option, if I didn't want to wait for another custom parse cluster to launch, which I don't, is I can grab this input ID and I can come back to my notebook and I can actually pass that within the parsing session so that I can start this notebook directly from Databricks. Since I already have a cluster running, now it just makes development and testing a lot easier because I have some existing data. I can just basically keep rerunning that parse process and make sure that my notebook logic actually works. So if I run this cell, we now can see that the parsing process is kicking off. If I go back to DataForge, I can see that in here. So if I click on the process, when you actually trigger it from Databricks rather than DataForge, because there's not necessarily context with the SDK on where it's coming from, you're going to see this triggered by parallel universe message. It just basically means that DataForge doesn't know exactly where this got kicked off from, but it'll still work. And so we can see that that actually worked successfully. If I look at the logs, I can see my new custom parameter printed in here. And then I can see my new column created in the raw schema from that parse process. So that's how you could use custom parameters, and you're not limited to the using a certain number of parameters. And those custom parameters are really what are going to allow you to make this notebook reusable and scalable across many sources. So you can use the same notebook and cluster configuration and attach it to many different sources and just change the custom parameters for each individual source. So the next thing that I want to show you is, in addition to custom parameters, we can also reference process parameters in our notebook. And so for context, when we look at the process, similar to where the logs are, we can click on the parameters option, and we can actually reference any of these parameters directly in our notebook as well. So in this case, I'm going to reference the input IDs and build that into my custom logic here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new row. I'm going to say, or name it input ID for the new val, and we're going to reference it very similarly to the custom parameters, but this time we'll use process parameters. And then we'll reference the actual field from that process parameters. And then in this one, for example, it could potentially be many different inputs that we're processing at the same time. So I'm going to save this as a vector instead, and then use the head function to call that. And then what I want to do is, rather than creating a new column, I just want to log and give myself some more context on which inputs we're actually processing. So we're going to say parsing input ID, and then I can reference that input ID val as well. So now I can rerun it again with that same input ID, and we're just basically resetting that parse process each time we run it. So again, I can come over here, I can see that the input's running. If I go to process, I can check and I can actually see that new process parameter getting printed in my logs. The last thing that I want to show you in this video is how to use parsing parameters. So that's the last set of parameters that you'll be able to call. An easy example of this is for every input that DataForge creates on a file source, we actually write down the file name as well of that original file that got ingested. So in this case, it was sales order header file.csv. So what I'm going to do is actually go back to my notebook, and I can add in a new val to reference any of those parameters as well. So if I say input file name is my val, and again we're going to call session, and this time it's going to be my parsing parameters, and we'll reference the parameter named source file name, and I'm going to save it as a string again. And this time I do want to create a new column with that file name. So we'll create the column as file name, and then we'll use the lit function again to reference our val. So once again, we can run this, make sure it runs successfully. We can see it running in DataForge. Again, it looked like it was successful, which is great. And then I can check my raw schema, and I can see that that file name was added as a new column. So that's how you can build and use the custom parse process and build your own custom notebook to parse your file data that's ingested. Now that you've got the working notebook, one thing is you would want to remove the specific input ID reference from your notebook. And then you would also want to change other source settings, that you may have been playing around with during development, such as the max retries and your schedule, for example. So again, hopefully this is helpful. That's how you'd use custom parse. If you have any feedback or questions on the training, please reach out. Thanks.